what I've tried to do in the book, and the book really focuses on case studies of either Jewish or Ukrainian writers who are writing about this commercial encounter, this commercial landscape. And as I was just mentioning to you, the Gogol's story, Gogol's Soroczynski Fair, Soroczynskaya Yarmarka, becomes the kind of proof text that other writers would go back and return to, that facilitates the literary encounters throughout the rest of the book. And one example of a Ukrainian writer who enters Gogol's fair, I think somewhat self-consciously, because he's writing really right after Gogol publishes his Dikanka stories, is Kvitka Znevyanenko in his Soldatsky Portret, which is a story that, like Gogol's Soroczynski Fair, uses the commercial landscape or the market space to frame the story. The encounters that take place within the story are cases of mistaken identity. There's a portrait that just looks like a soldier, but everyone, of course, mistakes it for a soldier, just to familiarize you with the story. And fights ensue, a little bit of romance ensues. And it's a story very much about the cunning and crafty relationship between the people that are living in this Ukrainian borderlands and also the Russian authority figures who are there. The soldier's portrait is, of course, a soldier's portrait that looks like a Moskal. It looks like a Muscovite, and yet it's really just a fake. And everyone has to figure out how they're negotiating their own relationships to this figure. Kvitka in that story doesn't talk about Jews at all. In that case, he's really dealing with the relationship between Ukrainians and Russians. But another story that I discuss in the book is his Yarmarka, his the fair, which is a novella, and there you have a family that travels to the fair, and within that fair there's a play. And there's a kind of comic moment when a play about some, ridiculous-looking Jews is sort of intertwined with a romantic play, and these two stories don't make much sense when they're put together, but they create all kinds of comic outcomes. And so here again, you have the encounter with the Jewish other that takes place at the fair, and that affects the way a Ukrainian story is positioned vis-a-vis the Russian center. It helps it as a gain credential as a story, as a useful story that's told from the margins of the empire, but those margins become enriched by all of the potential comedy. So what I'm really discussing in this book is fiction, for the most part, short fiction. I'm looking at stories and tales that are told. In a couple of cases, though, I do shift in genre. One example would be the early Soviet Yiddish writer Peretz Markesh, who has one of his really important long poems is called Die Kuppe, or The Mound. And that's a poem that was written in 1920, and that takes place in a marketplace the day after a pogrom. And again, he is referencing the relationship between Jews and Ukrainians at a marketplace, and it's really a tragic story about a dying market. So in that case, I do shift into poetry, but for the most part, I'm interested in the myths and the stereotypes that are integrated into stories, into fictional stories. Another really wonderful example of the translation or imitation of Gogol for a very different audience is the classic Yiddish prose writer Sholem Aleichem, who fashioned himself as a kind of Jewish Gogol. He even sort of wore his hair in the same way that Gogol did. He would call himself the Jewish Gogol. He very famously kept Gogol's Laughter Through Tears passage from Dead Souls on his desk. He was constantly citing Gogol. He weaves very intricate readings of Gogol plots into his own stories. And in several of Sholem Aleicham's stories, you have echoes, especially of Gogol's earlier Dikanka stories. Sholem Aleicham's writing in that same region. He fashioned himself a kind of lay ethnographer, much in the same way as Gogol did. And he's playing with these themes of Jews and Ukrainians. One thing that I find really interesting about Sholem Aleicham's refashioning of Gogol, though, for a Jewish audience, is that he's also tweaking Gogol's message. So most of his readers would be somewhat familiar with the tradition, with the literary tradition of Gogol. At least they'd heard tell of it. They're modern readers reading in Yiddish, and they know that Gogol's not the world's biggest philo-Semite. Let's put it that way. He's not the world's biggest anti-Semite either, but he's not necessarily exalting the image of the Jew. Especially in this Soroczynski fair, right? You have this Jewish tavern keeper, and the Jew is the only person in the whole story who's able to do business with the devil and to make a profit on the devil's coat that's pawned to him when the devil runs out of money. The Jew is a funny and kind of ridiculous figure in that story. And Sholem Aleichem takes that Jewish figure and rewrites it. First of all, his Jews never profit. His Jews are always failures at trade. So he's tweaking this stereotype of the Jew that profits at the expense of his Ukrainian neighbors.